Cool. So the way this is set up, this is a webinar. So I think, I'm not sure if you guys can see all of the participants, but yeah, so I guess I'll say a few words about what this whole project is and sort of the motivation for this particular event. So basically, we've got this fairly new little project that myself and some other physics and philosophy students at the University of Toronto have been putting together. It's this Ideas in Practice initiative. And the idea is, so there's a specialized program at U of T which focuses on jointly studying physics and philosophy at the same time. And we found it really valuable to be able to have these conversations, which let philosophers talk to people who do philosophically interesting things, but are not necessarily philosophers themselves, and vice versa. It's often beneficial for non-philosophers to get a chance to talk to philosophers who are interested in the same things that they are, or adjacently related things as well. So we figured that we would just try and put together something to create some discussions like that. I should thank our sponsors, because we've got some support from the Student Initiative Fund at U of T, as well as the McGill Postgraduate Student Society, because one of our organizers is now a graduate student at McGill. Yeah, so that's kind of the thing in general. And then for this particular event, there's kind of this picture that I had in mind of something that I thought it would be really cool to talk about with some people, which is, so you can imagine the following story. You begin with the physical world and all of the furniture of reality and everything that's out there. And then one of the first acts of philosophy is trying to figure out how we can actually exist in a world like that, and how we can come to perceive the world and come to understand it and have phenomenal experience of the world. So there's this close connection between the physical world and the world of phenomenal experience. But then once we actually look at the process of cognition and understanding our perceptions and our experiences, that allows us to actually make choices and take actions, and in turn feed back and influence things actually in the world directly. And when things go wrong in that process, we see people behaving in unusual ways. And there's all kinds of questions related to every aspect of this, starting from the physical world and ending back up with actions in the physical world that influence the world again on the other side. So that was kind of the motivation for this. So that's what inspired bringing this cohort together. So the outline for this program will be basically, I'll give each of you guys 5 minutes to just sort of say whatever you want to say about this very, very broad collection of topics. And then after that, I'll lead a moderated discussion with some questions that have been prepared, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And for members in the audience, if you have any questions along the way, please just send those to the chat or to I think there's a Q&A box as well. And then I can sort of put those in along the way, or at the end with the Q&A, I can promote you guys to panelists as well, and then you can ask your questions in person. So that is the plan for today. I guess I'll start, and so I'll introduce you guys one by one, and then you can each have a few minutes to talk about kind of your perspective on this very, very broad collection of topics. So I'll start with Christoph. So Christoph Simon is a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Calgary, and he's also currently a member of the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. He completed his PhD under the supervision of Anton Zeilinger, so he comes from a very prolific lineage of quantum information studies. And his primary research interests take him in two different directions, one towards quantum information processing and communications. So implementing tools from quantum mechanics to better create more efficient protocols for communication, things like that. He recently had a very big paper come out about the implementation of a proof of principle kind of quantum internet experiment, which is really quite exciting in the field right now. His other sort of strand of his research is more neuroscience oriented, and it's looking at kind of the quantum effects, the potential role of quantum effects in the sort of microphysical behavior of the brain. So a lot of really, really cool stuff. I'm really excited to hear from you, Christoph.
Thank you.
So would you like to?
Okay, I can go. So Yeah, so as you were already sort of indicating, um, I, I think the challenge that I'm trying to somehow help with is how to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview, right? Like we haven't really been able to do that. I think understanding how we can process information, you know, how we can maybe function, that's the easy parts. But then what remains is, I mean, the easier parts. But then there's what Chalmers calls the hard problem, right? Which is phenomenal experience or subjective experience or consciousness, or however you call it. And I think that that's really still a mystery, and we don't know what to do. Right? And like, should we think of it as fundamental? Should we think of it as emergent in some way? If so, in what way? Should we be panpsychists? Right? Does the phenomenal experience have a functional role? Or should we be epiphenomenalists? Right? So you can see I know some of the philosophy terminology a little bit. I'm sure I'm not always saying it exactly right, but those are, I think, the big questions, and so I'm trying to help with that from my quantum physics perspective. So quantum physics and consciousness are sort of topics that have touched in the past already, for sure. That there's one line of thought that asks whether whether quantum physics is trying to tell us that in fact consciousness has an impact on quantum systems, and that is has been debated over the decades, you know, and not really been resolved. But I'm actually more interested in the reverse question, which is whether quantum physics can help us understand consciousness. You know, whether quantum physics might underlie consciousness somehow. And I think I would like to highlight two reasons why I think that it might. So one is the binding problem, which is an unresolved, I would say, problem in neuroscience or consciousness research, right? Like how the, you know, if you look at the brain, it's a very modular system, right? It's clearly like a network of all these neurons, and then every neuron is a bunch of molecules, really, that of course interacting, but nevertheless. So how does something as unified as conscious experience arise out of that? And it really is. So just to illustrate what I mean by that, you know, it's a big difference. Like you can have one mind thinking about physics and one mind thinking about philosophy, right? And we all understand that that's not the same as having one mind that is thinking about physics and philosophy at the same time, right? So how, but how does that map onto the brain, you know, which has all this, like, okay, so that's the binding problem. And I think that um I'm hoping that quantum entanglement has something to do with this, right? So quantum entanglement is this unique quantum property where you can prove mathematically that you really cannot look at an entangled system as just consisting of its parts, right? That there's a uniquely holistic character there, and it's just a different thing. And that's, I think, unique in physics and unique in science. It's the only such thing, and somehow I feel like that could map onto consciousness. You know, maybe that really is the answer. Okay, so that's argument one. Then so philosophers often like this argument in my experience. The other people from other disciplines are often not so convinced. Let's say engineers say, or something like that. So for them, I have a second line of thought, and that has to do with quantum computing and quantum information processing, which is a big part of my job, right? So we do now, we are convinced, we have more and more evidence that quantum information processing is useful. So it is good to use, helpful to use, for example, entanglement for information processing purposes. If we have figured this out now after a few, you know, centuries of actually making technology, maybe a few millennia, but relatively fast, maybe nature did too, right? So then maybe nature is also using these quantum effects for information processing purposes. And that would then also mean, for example, that implies a bit of a stance of on epiphenomenalism too, right? If you think that consciousness is related to entanglement and entanglement is useful, you know, then probably consciousness is useful, which I think is believable, you know, because if it wasn't useful, like, why would we have it, right? Like, if you think about it evolutionarily, It just doesn't make sense to me. But okay, but these are our opinions, so we are trying now to come up with concrete proposals for how this might work in the brain, and then have them be falsifiable, like genuinely scientific things. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now. We can go into the details as we go
Awesome.
along.
Thank you very much. So that's really cool. There's a lot to pick up on there, and I hope that we'll get a chance to do so. I'm going to now introduce David Suarez, who is, so David is currently a philosophy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto in the Department of Philosophy. He also received his PhD from U of T some years ago. He's also held postdoc positions at UC Berkeley. And his research is primarily aimed at understanding and rehabilitating post-Kantian philosophy in order to develop it today to become a viable mode of philosophical inquiry. And he specializes in areas of phenomenology and German idealism. So, David?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. So I just wanted to kind of point to some ideas that kind of orient my thinking on this stuff. So I should also say I've done lab work in psychology, and my undergrad was in cognitive science. My dissertation at UT was about the intersection between the cognitive sciences and phenomenology. And so one of the things that I find interesting about the kind of Kant and the post-Kantian German tradition is that I think one way of seeing what he's up to is exactly this issue of trying to reconcile the scientific manifest images, so that the idea that, with the advance of kind of Newtonian science, of the physics, and the kind of really encompassing ability of that science to explain what's going on in the physical world, what remains of something like a human perspective and the idea that we're persons that do things for reasons, right? So that, I think, is a really important way for me of framing what ends up being now thought of as the problem of the relationship between the phenomenal and the physical. Because one thing that it does is to kind of sort of subtly shift what it is that's in need of explanation. So it isn't just then the explanation of this weird stuff, the mind, or weird feelings whose presence in the world needs to be explained, but the existence of these perspectives on the world that are constituted by our being able to think of it objectively, there being standards of rightness and wrongness there, and then having a tie to kind of moral questions and what we do in the world, right? So ultimately for Kant, this is driven by kind of moral concern, right? How can we still think of ourselves as being engaged in questions about the good, given that we have this all-encompassing, seemingly causally closed system from Newtonian physics. So one thing that I think that does in kind of reshaping, so in my thinking, I think that I'm a bit concerned with sort of, for example, Chalmers' framing of the hard problem, in that the explanatory question there, or the kind of metaphysical question for Chalmers, seems to be one of accounting for a kind of mental pain, right? Where, on the one hand, we have the physical description of the world. On the other hand, we have these feelings, just kind of, bare, color blotches, sounds, these are the kinds of examples that you get. And, these are supposed to be ineffable. And it's the presence of those that we're interested in. But what I get from Kant and the phenomenologist is the idea that, the way to think about consciousness is as perspective and as presenting something, as being a presentation of the world. And I think the reason that you get to something like a kind of mental pain view of what conscious experience, what the phenomenal is like, is through the kind of subtractive Cartesian thing, where the fact that I can get things wrong about the world, that how things objectively are, shows that whatever's going on with consciousness means, can occur in fundamental detachment, fundamentally detached from how things are outside of me. But I think that, there are lots of ways to think about how you could have, in certain ways, and this is where I think it connects up with your psychopathology question, the ways that people are forming pictures of the world, ways of thinking about how consciousness can be a relation to the world that can be disturbed in various ways, right? That can be in various ways not as it is when it's showing us how things really are, without being, essentially something that can occur detached from the way that reality is. And so I think that's sort of, the one line. The other is that something that Christoph said was really interesting to me about the idea of holistic systems and finding those, only as it were at the level of in quantum entanglement. I can't, I'm not going to be able to speak much about the quantum physics side of this, but so phenomenologically influenced philosophers of biology have thought that there are certain kinds of self-organizing systems at higher levels of organization that are causally, that are causal networks that are importantly, sort of self-differentiating from the stuff around them. So, I'm thinking of work in autopoiesis by Evan Thompson, who's my PhD supervisor at U of T, and others like Ezequiel Topalo in Basque Country in Spain. And so that I think is another way of thinking about what it might be to have a perspective on, or what it is that enables for there to be perspectives on the world that gets us sort of subjects in the rich sense that I was talking about. So that, these self-organized systems are the ones that get to be, on the one hand, related to the world, and on the other hand, in certain ways separable from it, so that you get a subject distinct from an object. So those are things that I'm interested in. The last thing I want to say is about the kind of fundamentality of physical explanation. And one thing that I've come to be convinced of is that it is, of course, correct that physics, in terms of the way that it's analyzing the world, has claimed to be sort of, the fundamental science. But what I'm wondering is whether the stuff that I'm interested in terms of, perspective on the world, reason giving, reason respecting, and being and personhood, whether those might not be just dimensions of reality that aren't appropriately describable in terms of physics, which is not to say, I want to add, like souls back into the equation, just that the very same world that has the physical particles in it is susceptible of other ways of discerning patterns and describing patterns, which are fundamental in some important way. They don't get reduced to or explained by other stuff, which is not to say that, there are definitely physical conditions for enabling, reason giving and reason respecting entities to exist, but it's not, it might just be a mistake to think that the explanation of that will be, forthcoming in physical terms, right? And I think that's what's right about sort of thinking of the hard problem and the explanatory gap, right? It might just be the case, right, that the physical description will never be a satisfying account of that, even if, right, it should turn out that there are these kinds of what I think, what people call psychophysical laws, right, for linking these two, right? Those might be stuff we can find out, but they won't be explanatory in the kind of way that I think people have been hoping for this. Yeah.
Awesome. Very interesting. Again, lots going on there. Okay, cool. So our last panelist for today is Rasmus Rosenberg Larsen, and he completed his PhD at the University of Buffalo, and he's presently an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the U of T, as well as a lecturer in the Forensic Sciences program at the University of Toronto Mississauga campus. From what I can understand, his main research interests cover issues in mental health research, moral psychology, biomedical ontology, and things of that nature. And he's currently investigating things pertaining to psychopathy and the theoretical validity of clinical instructions and things like that. Again, lots of cool stuff going on there. So please, Rasmus.
Thank you. Well, yeah, so I should say straight off the bat that my own work is not as philosophically sophisticated and profound as David's and Christoph. I tend to skew more towards very pragmatic and applied issues often, which is not to say that of course isn't sophisticated, and it's not what Dave and Christoph is doing. Of course it is to some extent. It all kind of overlaps at the end of the day. But yeah, but according to, so I'm involved in various projects, but I think one of the projects that overlaps most with what we're talking about today is perhaps my involvement with and some work I've been doing on how to apply phenomenology and philosophy of mind in general to mental health phenomena, or you could just say mental health issues, mental health studies. And one, so within the tradition of phenomenology, if I'm assuming that not everyone in this virtual room are phenomenologists. So if I should just give the cliff notes of what phenomenology is, and I'm sure I will be butchering it to some extent. Dave, you can yell at me afterwards if you disagree. But phenomenology is, to some extent at least, an attempt to try to formalize under which categories the mind, or so to speak, structured. So how our mind is working, if you will, through some sort of a introspective way of kind of reflecting on this, right? And of course, this has various applications, and there has been all sorts of sub-traditions being blossoming from this fundamental idea, I guess. But one way that we can apply this massive literature is that it might give us some really cool initial ideas on how the mind works, but then also the other side of that token is that it might give us some really cool ideas of how we can malfunction. So for example, in mental health, this becomes relevant, right? We like to think that some mental health disorders at least pertains to some sort of malfunctioning mind, at least that not all mental health issues are related to that. So this, of course, is not a novel thing to say. This has been done by many phenomenologists before me, certainly. But one of the first one was perhaps, or at least one of the individuals that has given a lot of credit for this is a German philosopher's name is Karl Jaspers. And he kind of initiated a tradition in speaking about mental health suffering using the language, if you will, from phenomenology. So he would speak of certain disorders being a malfunctioning of our time awareness or something like that, or malfunctioning of our bodily awareness and things like that. The topics that phenomenologists generally investigate, if you will. So what we are doing currently is that we are diving into this massive literature and trying to come up with some sort of standardized vocabulary. So if you have studied phenomenology, you would realize that there's so much secondary literature on how do we, what is bodily awareness? How do we describe that, and so on? What we're trying to do in this project is that we are going in to the literature and try to, and it's an effort that is going to take years and also will involve a lot of consensus among phenomenologists and psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on, and try to lift up from this literature a vocabulary, if you will, which is much more sophisticated in describing mental health issues. So for example, if you go to current nomenclature or current manuals such as the DSM-5, which to people not familiar with mental health studies, that's kind of like the gold standard of what sort of diagnoses that are out there. It will say about a diagnosis such as major depression that you have experienced sadness for a prolonged period. Okay, phenomenologists will say, well, sadness is not just sadness. There is multiple dimensions of it, and they have used the language of phenomenology to describe that. What we're trying to do is to capture that language that can describe that in detail, so we can later apply it in data collection efforts. So instead of just having a Excel column that says sadness, we have maybe 100 Excel columns that says whatever phenomenologists say about it, right? And hopefully we can balloon the complexity of mental health data at the end of the day. That's kind of the fundamentals of this approach. And one if I should say a little bit more philosophical about why this is, I guess, also in some way interesting, is that I haven't done any like deep work on this. I haven't published on this, but it's an interesting, or I think it's a problem that maybe Christoph can say much more about than I can. But for example, if you want to describe on the conscious level what is going on in a brain scan, so we all have seen the colorful pictures that we get out of certain software. We put people in a functional scanner, for example. You need to call that data something, right? The software is not going to tell you what that is, right? If you want to map it onto the person who is functioning inside the scanner, who is performing some sort of cognitive task. And in many ways, that is exactly the language that we're trying to create. So the thing is that has at least interested many phenomenologists is that whatever you're doing when you're trying to study, for example, the brain, you need to front load that effort with a language, with some semantics, that you can take that semantics and put on whatever it is you're measuring, right? So if you want to pair brain processes with what's going on in our mind, if you can even make that distinction, I believe that you might be able to, then what is going on in our mind is we need a language for that. We need a descriptive language for that, to kind of pair to whatever data we're yielding on the brain function side of it. And that is kind of like the pragmatic efforts of what I currently find interesting. Obviously, maybe I should just stop it there.
That's really great. So I think that actually that gives a really good segue to kick off a discussion. So the first question that I want to pose to you guys, and I think I'll more specifically direct it towards Christoph, but of course you are all encouraged to jump in. So there's this distinction between investigating the mind and investigating the brain, and we typically in neuroscience people typically talk about like correlates of consciousness and the mapping from certain phenomena in the brain to certain conscious experiences and phenomenal experiences and so on. And just in line with what Rasmus was saying, I'd be interested in hearing kind of what you envision as a way of creating a kind of taxonomy or language for talking about the relevant structures in the brain, using the kind of terminology that you find in quantum mechanics and using the kind of concepts of the basic physical processes that happen in these kinds of microscopic and mesoscopic systems in the quantum setting.
Yes, I don't know if we have quite reached that point, but it's a fair question. So I think it's really important, like if we want to understand consciousness, to work on having adequate language and adequate models for the mental side. And I do also feel that is, I probably don't know all the literature, but it seems to me that is by far not as well developed as sort of the physical side or biochemical side, right? So I think that's important, and that for sure deserves more attention. Like an area where I have seen some some things that I think one can maybe work with is in cognitive science, and the sort of the AI community. They have developed sort of concrete functional models of how they think the mind works. Like there's something called LIDA, for example. Stan Franklin, he has this like long, many decade effort of developing this model of the mind. I think that's great. I think that could for sure be refined, probably coming from phenomenology, like Rasmus was describing. So I think that would be very interesting and probably useful for because then in the end you want to map. I agree. You want to map the sort of mental phenomena that you have over here somehow onto the brain, right? And we haven't come very far in this, I think, and I would like to try to help with that. Now you are really asking, so how does quantum come in then? And well, I suppose what I would hope for is that, okay, so we try to map it onto like classical neural networks. Maybe after a while we see that it's not quite working for us, and that's where quantum would come in. But I think we haven't even tried to really map it onto the classical things very much, But I suppose what I would imagine would be that once we have this model over here and we say, okay, this is the conscious experience, in our mental model, that would map onto this entangled state of, these relevant degrees of freedom in this brain over here, right? That's what I imagine. And then, and then if you have two big entangled states, then you have a split personality or something, right?
So do you think of kind of, because these are such complicated systems and you'd require such large numbers of degrees of freedom, very large Hilbert spaces, do you imagine things like decoherence playing roles in like partitioning off different kinds of functional mechanisms in the brain and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, decoherence has to be taken into account, right? So when people develop quantum computers, this is front and center, how do you deal with that? So if we think that quantum is important in the brain, we have to imagine that the brain has evolved strategies for dealing with that too. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And then, yeah, I mean, if those strategies fail, let's say, maybe that's, when you have schizophrenia or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very cool. Right. So then another question related to that then, so there seemed to be a bit of disagreement between you and David on the subject of the sort of viability of having physical explanations for consciousness. So it seems like you're interested in trying to create these kinds of concrete physics-oriented explanations of the emergence of conscious experience from physical mechanisms. And it sounds like David is kind of pushing back against that and thinking more on the lines that there could be other fundamental features of physical reality or whatever you want to call it that give rise to this phenomenon. And I'd be interested in hearing you two kind of pose your views against each other in some way.
Maybe I want to start just to clarify what I mean and what I maybe don't mean. So, because I'm not against the idea that it might be a different dimension. And integrating consciousness into science can mean many things, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that science stays the same, right? Like I would say, if there's some other dimension that we are missing right now, then let's bring that into science. Let's make it formal and let's understand how it relates functionally to the other parts, and it's going to be a whole new science, right? So I want to give a concrete example from the kind of things that I'm imagining and debating with some other people in my area, right? A very naive way of integrating consciousness into the kind of quantum ideas that we have now would be to say, well, maybe it's a whole new field, it's a whole new or a different kind of particle or something, right? That would be one way of integrating it. But it could also be that, no, I mean, it's the same particles, and it's just when they do certain things that is when consciousness somehow comes out. For example, when they become entangled, So I like that kind of explanation more than the one where we say, oh, it's a whole new field, or a whole new particle. But this is maybe just to illustrate that integrating it into physics, like providing a physics explanation, can mean quite different things, right? Like maybe we are missing a dimension somehow, like David was saying, but then let's try to, make a model for that dimension, and then, because like physics, what physics really is, it's not about the things that we know right now, right? Like physics is an attitude, right? It's like whenever there's a new phenomenon, like we're going to make a model for that and try to make that model quantitative and predictive, and then we call that physics, So anything can be physics.
That actually speaks to something that I wanted to ask, and I just wanted to kind of sharpen it and just make sure that I'm clear about how you're thinking of this. But when we give those types of explanations, and when we succeed at giving those kinds of explanations, do they get rid of the explanations that we had before that, right? So does that deeper understanding of, say, the quantum level of the production of consciousness, of what we're thinking of as conscious experience, does that mean that now we know that the other explanations are not the true ones? So, the kind of what typically gets thought of as higher level explanations, are those just sort of, that's just shorthand for really it's the other thing?
I don't know that it necessarily means that. I think even in physics we find, even in much simpler areas of physics, that higher level concepts are of course important for our understanding, right? Like the computations or calculations, you have some notion of like the basic laws of condensed matter physics, let's say. Like we think that we basically understand like the fundamental laws of condensed matter physics, but that doesn't mean that we understand in a meaningful way why there is superconductivity or something, right? So like the work of like, and 80% of physicists, I don't know, a large number of physicists are condensed matter physicists, and they're working exactly on that, on like trying to develop concepts that will actually enlighten us. Even if I could simulate this superconductor, maybe I still wouldn't feel that I really understand what's going on, right? So intermediate level and high level concepts can be important. I think, okay, so in general, like in the case of consciousness, I think many people, at least I am one of the people who still feel that we are not just at that level, okay? Our lack of understanding is more profound. Like we are missing something fundamental. We don't even have the framework yet. So it's a bit of a different thing, I think. But also there, I think even more so than, I think different levels of description might be appropriate, right? In some sense. But what I am aiming for is to sort of bring it, make it more like condensed matter physics, I guess, in that sense, that at least we believe that we understand it fundamentally, and then we'll still have a lot to deal with, to really understand it functionally and concretely and so on. But like right now, we don't even have that basic level understanding, I think.
And if I can say something to that, so the groups that I work with and the methods that we normally apply to the research we do, it's typically goes under formal and applied ontology. It of course it originates in Edmund Husserl, but it's not necessarily have much to do with Edmund Husserl anymore. But and it is kind of like an approach that was taken over by computer scientists in trying to make data sets more computational. But now it's found various applications. For example, the gene ontology is an extension of the Human Genome Project, is one of the most popular examples of how ontology can be applied. So what we do with these methods is that instead of, for example, talking about which level is more fundamental and theorizing, if I may call it that, applied ontology first aims to be descriptive. So meaning that it adheres to certain rules of the game, if you will, like methodological positions that it takes, and we can go into that if that's interesting. But generally, if I again can stick to the cliff notes of this, it means that what you need to do in applied ontology is to describe different domains. Okay, so the immune defense system is a domain, and the body is another domain. The interesting part here becomes, what role does the immune defense system play in the body, and how does these two domains link together? And here we can make a similar comparison to, for example, the brain is a domain that can be studied and mapped and described. And we can use that description to theorize about how the brain then works. As long as we agree on the descriptive parts of it, the domain, how that is accounted for, then we can start to make more profound theories about it. And then of course you can say, well, then it becomes an issue of how does the domain of the brain link to the domain of the subjective experience of the world. So phenomenology, if we can use that term, right? So how does these two domains link up together? What is the formal relationship between those? And that would be how I would approach that. That is a very pragmatic approach, of course. But as long as, what should I say? I should say, as far as you can down the road, try to remain theoretical. So you're not aiming for an explanation, but a descriptive project. And then later on, when you've succeeded in that, which is a massive success if you can, then you can start to theorize about how this works. Problems often occur when people start with theorizing. That's at least my experience from many other aspects, because we make so many mistakes. We might have described the subject matter wrongly. We have maybe we have talked about things that reach over several domains and we haven't even occurred to us. Maybe we haven't made the fallacy of reification, where we have a concept that we think has an entity in the world, but it doesn't, right? Such as, whatever it is. Just because you have a concept doesn't necessarily mean that there's a descriptive entity in the world, right? So there's all sorts of fallacies we can make within our language. So my approach is to start controlling that part first, and then we can later move on, right?
So I wanted to just build quickly off of that, which is, I see phenomenology from, Husserl onwards as kind of taking the suggestion that the unifier of these different explanatory domains and explanatory methods, we already have access to it, and it's our human perspective on things. Right. So that, the contribution of phenomenology is not to replace physical explanations or to say that they're founded on, on consciousness in some kind of theoretical, in the opposite direction, reductive way, right? To say it all reduces to kind of, right, this stuff consciousness, but to say that, to understand how physics relates to what psychologists study or what people have been thinking about when they think of conscious experience, think about how those are related within a human perspective, right? So what conscious experiences generate something you think of as physical data, right? What types of experimental situations are the ones that we're counting as insight into fundamental reality? And then, from there, I think you can start to see some of the kinds of problems that people were worrying about disappearing, right? I mean, there are still the ones about, like, where do we slot in this event that we call having an experience? That's still a problem, right? But yeah, certain ones about the interrelations between levels, well, it's just that, the world that we live in is showing up to us in these different ways. And, when I have certain experiences, I say certain things are true of the physical world, and I'm completely right in doing that. Yeah. Yeah. And so just one last turn on that. I mean, the approach that I take is again, it's not, I want to resist as much as possible dictating to scientists what they should do or say, but the value, I think, of what I do is that I want to show how those results can be part of, I always thinking of this as a kind of like user's manual for a human life, where it's sort of it's important to contextualize science in terms of, right, what we do with it and how we do it, and to think that the best version of science would be a kind of like view from nowhere theory of things. I just think that's kind of a misguided view. What we should think about as the value of the sciences and their relation to the rest of our lives.
So it kind of sounds like what you're proposing is almost like taking the features of phenomenal experience and saying that those are actually, it's not that those need to be understood in terms of physical variables or anything like that, but that they already are somehow basic fundamental variables of the physical world. Namely, the physical world can only be understood from the vantage point of phenomenal, subjects undergoing phenomenal experience. And part of the world that they describe is the content of their own experience. Is that kind of in the right?
Yeah, that's in the ballpark. I mean, I guess I mean, I think the stuff that Rasmus was saying about regions is right, because, you know, I think it's important to see that the rules for talking about the relationship between, you know, experience as I undergo it in the first person and the sorts of things that we study in physics or even psychology, right? The rules for that make it the case that I think it's hard to see, you know, how, for example, causation works in the transition from one experience to another, right? So it's like, it's perfectly fine to say that, you know, there are causal laws governing, you know, these kinds of small scale interactions that we find in the world, but you know, attending to the structure of experience within experience, that kind of causality doesn't seem to be sort of relevant or needed for the kind of understanding that we have of what's happening to us in the first person. And so, you know, the kind of, I guess, fundamental, what I wanted to suggest, this is the kind of like big thing, and I wish, you know, I had better arguments for it, but, you know, it's to set aside fundamentality in exactly the way that Rasmus is saying, and just see the connections properly. That's it, you know, so it's just all of that gets, you know, we can make mistakes in description, but ultimately the aim is going to be to just a bunch of descriptions, which we all take to have some, you know, they're livable for us, they're essential and eliminable parts of how we live, they're well confirmed, and to just be fine with those connecting in certain ways. You know, there are evidentiary connections from experience to this other stuff, and then we, you know, to some extent, it becomes not the right question to ask anymore, right? By what right do I say that consciousness exists? You know, well, that's not the sort of evidence we have for it, you know, right? It's not something we causally try to determine.
So I think I agree with this spirit that, like, you know, because our notion of what's fundamental constantly changes in physics too, right? Like for some decades it's protons and neutrons, and then it's quarks, and then maybe it's strings, and, you know, so I don't think one should get hung up on that. I think the goal that I see is to yeah, just to broaden our model, you know, so that we can integrate this domain of experience, right? Which we currently are not doing. Right now, we are sort of modeling the brain, and we can make predictions for how the brain is going to behave. And like, it would be better if we had then on top of that, you know, the ability to say, okay, and I mean, we have it a little bit in a rudimentary way, but if we could make it much more quantitative and predictive and so on, to say, okay, and that's what that means for experience, you know. And on the other hand, if at the experiential level, you know, this thing is happening, you know, this is what's probably happening in the brain, and you know, and at the molecular level, and so on, just to have much stronger links between these domains. Yeah, that's the goal.
And the thing is that I'll always, when I talk to students about this, and also wherever you do your stuff, right, it's such a simple idea, right? But I think it's important to emphasize how profoundly wrong we often get it when we do science on this, because you will see, for example, a study in psychology where they claim to be studying experience of fairness, and then they do a data collection on people's experience of fairness. And you, and it's almost to the extent where you can say, well, you can put anything you want into that Excel document. First of all, you haven't even defined what an experience is. You haven't even defined what fairness is. You haven't even, like, there's so many things that are undefined, but they nevertheless sneak their way into the science. That's what our science is built on. But your precision in your study will never be better than the precision in language that you have used to create the data. So this is a clear example where, of course, we can see that. So whatever the psychology study here will yield is just going to be maybe not silly, but close to. Okay, so, but you can see how profound this problem gets when we're talking about the brain, the vastly most complex thing we know aside from the universe, and then human experience at large, which is insanely complicated. How do we map these two domains? Dude, you better need a formal language for this that everybody agrees on. Otherwise, we will never be able to synthesize the research that is done in Croatia and Canada and United States. And if we don't even agree on the language, you know, homogenizing data sets that has millions and billions of data points, good luck. It's never going to be done, right? We need to agree on things from the beginning. That's kind of the deeper point of all this, right? If this is the strategy, well, let's get started from the very fundamentals first, right?
Well, I have a question for both of you too, and I'm genuinely just curious about how you think of this in your approach to things. I have an inkling of what I think, but it's you know, I'm not so sure about it. Which is the need to, in our models. So you mentioned formality, Rasmus, and you know, I think it's right to think that we need to think about general forms. Not everything can be particulars. We have to think of features that are shared. But what's the role of quantitative description in this? Must a true and final description of consciousness, for example, be quantitative, or could there be something that whose dimensions are inescapably qualitative? Because that's just one of the very old questions in the kind of birth of the physical sciences, right? Is that elimination, right, of Galilean elimination of the qualitative.
Yeah, so Christoph, I think this is really a question you should answer, but I would think that such a question is just fundamentally empirical. That, you know, it's a good question, but it's something that empirical science will tell us, right? We have done a really good job at formalizing the quantum world so far, right? So science is always adequate test. It will always improve, as Christoph mentioned, and so far we have this. But if you look at the mapping of particles, that is like a perfect ontology. It's very, very formal. We know exactly how to define, at least the standard model, for example, is a perfect ontology. Almost is very, very clear, and so on. People know what they mean when they say the Higgs boson or whatever, right? It's so it's going to be an empirical question what that domain will play, which sort of role it plays, and when we map it onto others. That's how I look at it. I don't know if Christoph agrees on this.
So I wouldn't think of making something quantitative as eliminating the qualitative aspect, right? I think the goal would be to have quantitative models for our qualitative experience.
Yeah.
Right? Like
I'm on board with that. Yeah.
How high dimension, like Rasmus was saying before,
Yeah.
how many dimensions does the sadness space have, right?
Yeah. Good. That's the sort of example I was thinking of.
Where is your sadness vector, sadness space or something? I think that's what we want, what I would imagine that we would want, like something that, a quantitative framework that does justice to the complexity of our experience, and that you can map onto the brain network, whether it's quantum or not. On the other hand, that's clearly a complicated thing that's somehow quantitative. But again, a thing that's also amenable to qualitative descriptions at some level. And even if it's a neural network, you can talk about it in purely quantitative ways, or you can try to talk about it in conceptual terms too, right? So I don't think that's a contradiction.
I like this description of it, though, as the goal of quantitative model, and it being a model of a space which is something taken to be distinct from it. One thing I worry about in some consciousness studies is to think that once you have a model of the kind of informational space, that informational space just is the same as the space that's being, the kind of at the qualitative level described. And that just seems to me sort of a kind of, that's a bit quick, right, to make that move, to think that once you've got something with the right dimensionality and causal relationship, say, to color perception, like psychologists do this, right? I have something that has all of that, then I have discovered, sort of, what vision, color vision experience, that is it. I found it,
I think there quantum physics is a good reminder of that distinction, because it's so weird, like we have these quantitative models, and like we know how they work, we know what to do with them. And does that mean that that is the thing? It's easier. I think it's easier to fall into this trap if you have like a Newtonian framework or something. It's easier to stay out of it in the quantum world, where we are always reminded, okay, there's the wave function, but the wave function, is that the thing, or is that epistemologically? People are debating that to this day. I think it's the universe reminding us that there are models, and then there's reality, and like we shouldn't assume that our model is the ultimate, ultimate reality. Like I can't, like the thing in itself is like it's elusive, right? I think. So we are making models, but that shouldn't prevent us from, that doesn't prevent us from improving our models and from
certainly
increasing the domain of applicability of those models. Right? I think that's what we're trying to do. And there, I think the frontiers are, I guess that's not such a proper term now, but like there's still this big thing that's not in our models, which is phenomenal experience.
Not to dwell, if you want to change the topic, Patrick, but
we'll carry on.
So one thing that it's a very dark secret of mine that I think about when I'm alone. Well, of course, it's not a secret because I'm telling it to you guys, but it's definitely dark, right? So what I often wonder about is whether the scientific method can succeed in delivering the results we want in exactly these topics here. So let me give you an example of, for example, from mental health studies, right? It's no big secret that mental health research has failed miserably over the past 20 years. And as far as long as 10 years ago, there was complete restructuring of the funding model for research, and a lot of things were scratched and so on. It's a hot mess. At least that's what researchers tell themselves. I often wonder whether we can, within the framework of science, so science it's really good at detecting universal things that in the world, but because of how we do empirical research, there are of course limitations to the type of questions we can answer, right? This is just standard as philosophy of science 101. But I do wonder in mental health science, so let's just say that we successfully map the language that is used to describe subjective experiences. But you have to think further, right? What is going on once we want to make a scientific study on this? Then you need a person who is the inquirer, the clinician or whatever, sit and talk to a person who's suffering from some mental health issue. Then you need that person to describe that other person's experiences in order to get a reliable capturing in the data of that person's suffering. Here we have a reliability issue. We might have a perfect language, we have a reliability issue. And I'm often wonder whether we can even solve that reliability issue you have between people, because you're measuring something as like it's purely subjective, or I shouldn't say that way. The experience of your mental health issue is a subjective experience that you are communicating over to a clinician who needs to put it down in a spreadsheet, quote unquote, right? Or whatever sophisticated data capturing method that person has. And then that data will further funnel into maybe being mapped onto some functional magnetic imaging technology, whatever, or genetic testing or whatever is going to be the case, right? But you see here, there's a practical issue and I often, and this is why it's very dark, because I'm still doing the research, but I'm not sure I actually think we can solve this issue. I think it might actually, because it's not just me sitting with person A who's suffering from some delusion symptoms, right? No, we need 1 million people to create a data set that is large enough to make powerful studies that can be, that has all the replication and reproducibility that, so we can say this is now science, right? But then we need hundreds of thousands of clinicians to participate in this, which they all have different backgrounds, different biases, and so on and so on. I often wonder whether that's even possible. I honestly don't think it really is. That's why it's dark. But I'm still doing it, I guess, the research, and hope that it is possible. And I really often wonder that. So there's a practical problem at the very forefront of all of these issues we're talking about.
I think this really brings up a fairly global concern. And I think that this is something that you guys will all have very different perspectives on, which has to do with how we come to understand the intersubjectivity of reality. Because at all different levels, the typical way of beginning to figure out the world is to suppose, okay, the world is how it is, and I'm sort of a participant in the world, and I can go and look at the world, and it'll behave in some particular way, and that's the world. And then you see these whole philosophical programs, like the sort of classic examples of Descartes or Kant, starting from the perspective of the thinking subject situated in the world, trying to uncover the features of that world. But what you, Rasmus, have just been sort of poking at it is that there's a lot of, as soon as you have multiple thinking agents in the same world, there's all kinds of interactions and feedback loops that are going to happen. And it's going to get really, really difficult to even make sense of that. And in quantum foundations, this has become a very pronounced issue quite recently. I mean, it has been an issue for a while, but more recently, there's a lot of research in foundations like these so-called like Wigner's friend scenarios and extended Wigner's friend scenarios, where having different agents looking at the same physical systems lead to paradoxes when you look at how they describe the same systems from different vantage points. So I'd be interested in hearing you guys all talk about how we can try to make sense of the world intersubjectively, given that we only ever have one perspective to work with.
I think I'm optimistic about this, because in practice we manage just fine, right? Like we all agree on like what a car is and what a chair is and so on. So I don't see why we wouldn't be able to agree in the long. I don't want to minimize the complexity of all of this, but in the end we are all very similar. We are going to come up with similar ideas. The fact that there's many of us will probably help us, because the patterns will emerge really much more easily than if there were just 5. If there's really 100,000 clinicians, I think you will be able to separate, what are things that are accidents and noise from the structure. Like we have done it before, we can do it again. I think that's what I think. We are doing it all the time, right? We agree on all kinds of things. And then there are things that we don't agree on, and those are the tricky ones, right? But like we do make progress. So I'm more optimistic than you sounded there, Rasmus. I think if we put our minds to it, and like work together in interdisciplinary ways and so on, I think we can like make real progress on all of these things.
Well, and I think that there are kind of 2 levels at which we can kind of be thinking about the problem of intersubjectivity, right? Because there's, the Cartesian worry, which is just sort of, are we in the same world at all? And then there are questions about the extent to which we're sharing, to which we're agreeing about what that world is like. And I think the asking of the question in the first place is one that kind of, at a kind of, what Kant's thinking of at the transcendental level, presupposes the possibility of sharing a world with others, right? So the really kind of extreme solipsistic worries, I think we can just get rid of, right? Because, the conceivability of sharing a world is a precondition for there being objectivity in the first place, right? So insofar as we can ask that, we also seem to think that there would be something that would be satisfying. And so, but the kind of, in working it out, right? So there are these kind of, in clinical cases, if you and your clinical subject can't agree on sort of very fundamental descriptions of what's happening, right? That becomes a problem, and similarly, so I guess the thing I'm interested in, I guess, in the dimension of the physical is, what if it turned out that there were just like radically inconsistent, at some level, of course, cars, but, at some level, things that couldn't be brought together. Could that be a discovery? Couldn't that be an empirical discovery? And isn't like, I'm very bad at the philosophy of physics, but isn't that kind of what happened with relativity theory, where it's certain ways of thinking about what the shape of reality, what kind of agreement we ought to expect went away, because the empirical stuff showed us that we should not look for those anymore.
Yeah, so I also I didn't want to come across as a very pessimistic. I'm generally, as you probably also can tell, a very happy and jovial person, and I'm also very optimistic in terms of science. And I'm glad that Christoph is emphasizing that I should be optimistic with this problem here, and he might actually be completely right. So that gives me some grace or whatever. but yeah, there are deep problems involved in these research questions that needs to be addressed, right? I think maybe that's how we.
I just wanted to maybe give one example for things that might not be possible. So if, let's say that somehow this is really quantum, our brains work in a quantum way, then there is something called the no cloning theorem in quantum physics. That you can't make copies, or you can't make a machine that makes copies of unknown quantum states. So that would then apply to our minds and to our brains. So you wouldn't be able to make a universal copying machine for mind states. So which would give a certain meaning to what it, because the mind is somehow subjective in that sense. Like so you couldn't actually then image somebody's brain state and make a copy of that. That would not work. But you can make approximate copies, for example, and you can. Yeah, it doesn't mean that doesn't prevent us from doing quantum information processing and from understanding what's going on. But there might be you might be right. Your intuition that there are some fundamental limitations could be completely accurate. It might be that you can't get like perfect reproduction and so on of a mind state, but there might still be features that you can capture that are useful and important, right? So.
Yeah, I like that last point of yours, that it would be nice if we knew everything, right? But there are also such things as we first of all like knowledge that's useful, right? Of course there's science of science sakes and all that, but scientists also like to come across as useful, and philosophers, believe it or not, also sometimes want to come across as useful. And it might not be, there might be certain things that we might not be able to answer, but it also doesn't really matter. That we can kind of, and we arguably do that already, right? We might not perfectly understand how the immune defense system works, but we know how to make a vaccine still, right? Things like that.
Exactly. And we know, I think the big asset that we have is our similarity, right? So like we can still, and of course, maybe that reaches its limits, maybe in mental health, like you were saying, if that person's mind really works in a fundamentally different way from yours, you might have a problem there, right? So I can see that you might run into certain limits, but still, there's a lot of common humanity still that I think we can all draw on.
Christoph, do you think that we will find, let's just say our time awareness, let's just say that's a function of our mind, right? That we can perceive things as if they occur in some sort of linear fashion, and there's no other way we really perceive that. And when we don't, that seems to be a malfunctioning, and maybe that's what's wrong with certain symptoms of schizophrenia and so on. Do you think that there will be, for us to discover a universal way in which the brain is functioning on a neurological level that kind of gives rise to that function itself? Or do you suspect that we will find that we can take people who are now experiencing things in time, and then when we look at the brain, it's completely stochastic. There's no like universal patterns as such. I've often wondered that. I don't know what.
I'm not so knowledgeable about the time things, but I do think people work on the sense of time, and like there are people who understand this better than I do for sure, and it is a topic in neuroscience. So I don't know if I.
Well, I mean, just like in general, what is the? I don't know if you have done any work, or if you have any expectations what we're going to find here, whether the mind is, or sorry, the brain is somehow universally construed in a way that gives right to these same universal functions. If there's a clean enough mapping, because if there isn't, then it seems like a lot of imagery studies might be futile, right? At least at the end of the day.
I would think that it is highly structured.
Yeah.
I guess that's a belief that one has to have if one goes into this area, right? But that has served us well in science in the past, right? So in the Middle Ages, the people who started doing science, they partly were encouraged by the fact, by the idea that this was created by God, in a like comprehensible way, so we can go and like, try to comprehend it, right? And I think this is still driving us. Like I think there's a lot of structure. It's not a random mess, right? Like it clearly grew out of something pretty simple and so. But yeah, how to what extent can we figure it out? I don't know. But I think we can still understand a lot more than we currently understand. That I really believe.
Yeah, I agree on that. Yeah.
So this is a really great conversation, but I think it's a good time now to maybe try and get some audience questions in. So there's a few of those queued up in the Q&A. So there's a question from Nitika, except she sent a message later saying to ignore that because she really liked the conversation and thought that was a better use of time. So I'll go to Paul's question. So Paul says, this is a question for Christoph. What is the timescale of feature binding in the holism of conscious experience as tested in psychophysical experiments? Is this timescale long enough to allow conventional neurobiological processes? If so, then why posit quantum processes?
So I don't know about the time scale. Like my argument is not so much about the time scale. I think it's sort of more fundamental than that. Like if you have and that David said something related actually before that where I made a note. So I think the argument is, yes, I mean, you can have classical dynamics that is in some sense holistic, like David was talking about self-organization or also in classical systems, one can look at them as being unified sometimes, and that can be a useful perspective. But in a classical system, you can always also analyze it and in some sense completely understand it in terms of its parts. You are not forced to take this holistic perspective. It may be useful for your comprehension, but you don't have to. Whereas in quantum physics, it's fundamentally different. Like you are not free to look at an entangled quantum state as, the dynamics of its parts. It's just you are missing something fundamental, and you can express that quantitatively in like Bell's inequalities and things like that. So there is a fundamental difference, and I think that maybe that maps onto what's happening with the mind. You really cannot the experience, our mental experiences, you can't look at them as consisting of their parts. That just doesn't make sense. That this is not something you can meaningfully do. Then it's a different experience, right? And similarly for a quantum state, if you cut it into its pieces and you look at those, that's a different quantum state. So that's what I'm trying to say.
Right. Cool. So there's another question as well. So this is from some anonymous attendee who says, what would you say about hard determinism? I'm aware of some research that indicates that consciousness of decision-making happens after the decision was made. clearly our world is not Newtonian, but at least not on the scale of consciousness. But does quantum mechanics resolve the issue of free will, or does phenomenology propose a dimension of consciousness which circumvents this issue? So that's a very big question, and I will pose it to all of you.
Did you want to go first, Christoph, or I can go first if you don't want.
I can say something on it. So in principle, there's still a version of quantum physics that is deterministic, right? Like if we really believe in many worlds, that the whole universe is in a pure quantum state and so on, that's actually a deterministic theory, at least at the level of the universe. So it's not clear that would change that. Of course, from the individual subjective perspective, then there is certainly randomness there. Is that the same as free will? I don't know. I think, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't want to give a definitive answer to that. I think we can study consciousness and try to solve the hard problem without necessarily agreeing on what we mean by free will, or whether that's a meaningful concept or not. I think those are two separate questions.
Yeah, that reflects some of what I would want to say about it, which is that I do think that physics gives us reason to think that libertarian free will, the idea that the will has causal effect on the physical world, like that can't be right, but that's not to say, and this is where I think the kind of Kant's way through this, and eventually the phenomenologist, the existentialist way through this is interesting, which is that physics unveils to us a description of the world, a region of the world in which determinism obtains. It's simultaneously true that when I live in the world, I do not and I cannot think of myself in that way. It's not actually what the scientific attitude either requires or is to be it doesn't make it the case that I no longer make decisions that have these effects. And actually I think this is one of the places where Dan Dennett's stuff on free will is interesting, right? Where he's saying that, look, the things that you're worried about in worrying about whether you're free, we can account for those within a kind of world that is described physically. It's not a big concern, and the desire to have magical effects from outside of the physical world on it, I just don't think that that's what is required for moral responsibility. It's not required for me to worry about whether someone is coercing me or making me politically unfree. This is not the way to worry about freedom.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything really profound to add to that. I basically agree with both comments here. It's I think often, maybe just quickly, the philosophical questions are interesting often because of what they produce, kind of the thoughts that they lead to. They're not the question themselves is not necessarily have to be profound. I don't know if it's so meaningful to ask the question just basically whether you have free will or not. It's more like the conversations that kind of blossom out of that is often what is value. Because you can easily accuse it of being this, just because you make up the term, it's not necessarily clear that there's any clear definition of it. But it's, yeah. So, but I'm not going to say more about that.
I think it may be one of these questions where once we have a better model, we'll have I think for like how the mental relates to the physical and so on, that model starts to work, we'll have a better handle on this question too. It will have more of a meaning, because like what is even, right, like the Buddhists would say, what is this I that you're talking about? Who is this person that is free, like, or not free? What does that even mean, right? So yeah,
very quickly take the shape of a question or a perspective that is not even falsifiable, and is like,
yeah.
What do we do? They can give rises to very interesting conversation often, and those can themselves be very productive and lead to new ways of thinking and so on. But they're often it's often questionable whether they're scientific in a way. Often that's at least my experience. This question included.
Yeah.
So there's a question that I have for Rasmus now. So I'll just note first. So we've got about 5 minutes left on the time that you guys all agreed to be here for. So if anybody has to leave, we can totally wrap that up. But it sounds like there's still a lot that people are interested in talking about. So I'm happy to stick around for a little while afterwards if people still want to chat. But yeah, if anybody does need to leave, of course, that you're welcome to. So the question I have for you is, it's about how morality plays into all of this. And I guess this is something all of you can contribute to as well. But when we think about the relation between the physical world and the phenomenal world, and if we do try to make this kind of physical reduction to phenomenal experience, it stops being so clear, first of all, what makes something moral or immoral if it's just the causal course of nature playing out. But more interestingly, I think in this context, if we look at things like mental disorders as being instances where a certain physical process doesn't play out in the way it's supposed to, then to what extent can we talk about moral responsibility of somebody with mental disorders, for instance? And how do we, for instance, in legal proceedings, what grounds do we make those kinds of judgments on?
Yeah. Well, this is a super interesting question, and there's a lot written about it, it's just important for people who are not so familiar with to realize that there are many different levels of complexity in that question, because it's often a question that plays out in legal systems, and legal systems have their own lives, right? They decide by convention what is true and false, right? So whether you think a person is legally / morally responsible within that system or not, that is not necessarily a decision that is made on philosophical musings. It's often just, by fiat decided, right? But typically we talk about whether a person is at least legally and perhaps also morally responsible is whether this person has the capacity to comprehend that what that person did is right or wrong, right? Most legal systems have this written into their criminal code. The Latin word is mens rea. You have to meet the mens rea condition, and that basically means something along the lines that you can comprehend what is right and wrong. And most mental health problems will not fall under that, meaning that even people who suffer from quite severe schizophrenia can even sometimes be fully aware of what is right and wrong, and will not necessarily be deemed not criminally responsible due to mental disorder. So, but I don't know if you wanted to reach further into this whole thing. If we discover that there's no free will, say, or something like that, and again, I'm not sure what the real world implication will be, because again, the decision where it has real world implication, that's again the legal system, and they don't care what the science says really. They care what they can all agree on, right? And there's proceedings and so forth, right? So it's a very complex, and there's a lot of really interesting philosophical things you could say about this problem, but in the practical realm, it gets heavily reduced in complexity all of a sudden.
Right.
Did I answer your question, you think?
I just threw a whole bunch of questions at you, and you answered a bunch of them in several ways. So.
Well, and I wanted to suggest, one paper I found really, really useful for thinking about this is P.F. Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, where he argues that, most of our moral evaluations of other people just have nothing to do with whether they're metaphysically free, right? It's like, if you did it because you're mean, that's enough. And it doesn't matter why you're mean. If you just did it because you like hurting people, that's not a good reason. And that's morally bad, and I will judge you. So like there might be reasons for that, and that gets a bit complicated. How do we discount for that? But
kind of minimize the scale of the explanation.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's exactly that. But that's just to say that in practice, our moral judgments just really are not hostage to this. Like that's not how we worry about these things.
I think the whole whole moral philosophy. So in everything that's written on morality, if you will, which is a lot, by the way, you often distinguish between at least two, and there are many more, but at least two fundamental. There's the normative questions, such as what one ought to do, right? We typically don't think that experimental research, empirical research, is going to have any good answers to any of that, whether adultery is more wrong than something else, right? Whether we ought to think that or not, right? But so then there's also the moral psychology side of it, which is exactly what Davis here is addressing, that when people actually make moral judgments, they don't seem to care whether you they don't take into consideration, at least, whether you have free will or not, right? I mean, you see parents beating up their children, right? And philosophically, we philosophers say that, hey, they are not responsible because they are not full agents yet. And the parent who just beat up his or her child, they don't care, right? It's that's not how they make their decisions, right? Human beings make decisions in many, many different ways, right? And it's also moral decisions, right? Mm-hmm. Speaking to that, lastly, it's a very curious question to even ask whether there is something called a moral judgment. Like, they're judgments, okay? Mm-hmm. Are there moral judgments? That is the question that has popped up several times recently in the literature. And I'm mentioning also because I have an article that's soon going to come out on this. It's actually very difficult to define moral judgments from other judgments. I would say it's impossible. And when you do it, it certainly doesn't map onto what we would normally call a moral judgment. So maybe there's just judgments. Maybe they're value judgments about right and wrong, but we make many judgments about right and wrong that doesn't necessarily fit that domain that we call morality. So this is another level of complexity to that fundamental question you asked, Patrick, which I'm not sure I have good answers to when we go down that line, because many social conventions kind of fall apart when we realize that it's really hard to define certain things, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Awesome. So it is now 1:30. So I don't know if any of you guys have to run, but if any of you do, I just wanted to thank you all very, very much for coming out. I think this was so far a really, really exciting discussion, and it's been really great to have you guys. So I think that it would be great to continue this if people are interested and available, but if you guys have to run, by all means.
I have another half an hour. I thought it was from...
That's about how long I have. Well, yeah, but I'm happy to, this is...
Yeah, I could be a little bit longer too. But...
Okay, awesome. So I'll go now. So there's a question that I got a note to not ask because there was a lot of cool stuff happening. So now I'll ask that question. So this is from Nitika, and she says, you distinguish between, so this is for Christoph, you distinguish between people working on understanding how consciousness may affect quantum phenomena and how people who study consciousness may depend on quantum processes to understand them. Would you not say that both these aspects could be related? That understanding precisely how consciousness may depend on quantum processes, in fact, could shed light on how consciousness could affect quantum phenomena in the first place, and vice versa.
Yeah, they absolutely could. Just to clarify, like what I was trying to say before is like, so for example, some people believe that consciousness is what causes the quantum state to collapse, right? And that could be true, or it could not be true, and that would of course have an impact on how consciousness works too, right? I agree if that was true. But I was just saying that my own focus was like not so much that, but just trying to look for, quantum phenomena in the brain and try to understand if they are somehow being used there. But of course these things are related. If maybe the brain uses that. Some people who think about quantum phenomena in the brain think that collapse of the wave function, for Roger Penrose, for example, he thinks that collapse of the wave function is an important part of what's going on in the brain, and that is somehow being used. But you can believe that that's not important, really, like the evolution of the quantum state is unitary, and like it's just the usual one, and still that could be underlying consciousness somehow. So it's just they're just different perspectives and different questions.
I'd personally be interested in knowing what your thoughts are on the sort of so-called quantum Bayesianism kind of school of thought. So just for the other panelists, there's this program of trying to interpret quantum mechanics as like a pragmatic theory for assigning subjective probabilities to future experiences. So kind of forgetting about all the furniture of reality business and just talking about how do I predict my subjective best bets in certain scenarios. And that's been taken as a pragmatic interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so I'd be interested in hearing kind of what you guys think about the prospect of trying to think about fundamental physics as this subjectivist calculus in some way.
So I'm not super familiar with like the Bayesian, quantum Bayesian philosophy or perspective. I think I guess my philosophy is that we are trying to make models, and models that we can somehow agree on. For how the universe works and the world works and how the brain works and then how our minds work and so on. So and I think we want them to be inter-objective and so on, and of course quantum physics inter-subjective, or in some sense objective, and quantum physics is that. I think we all agree on how to use it, or all of us who have taken the appropriate courses and so on. So I guess I don't know. I can't give a clear answer to that. I don't know the Bayesian approach well enough.
Right. So you kind of want to put the emphasis on there's a world and I'm in it and I perceive myself as being in it. And so to theorize about the world is to legitimately theorize about the world and not just my perception.
Yeah, I think that's our goal in science. Yeah, like it's I think that's the reason we should. I think that's the reasonable goal somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this. I mean, it has been described in many different, very expensive philosophical terms, but some people call it critical realism, right? That it's not naive realism that you just say, oh, here's reality. I have complete access to reality. No, you kind of play ping pong with it, right? You test it and you get a more and more seemingly accurate understanding as science progresses of the external world. If I hate the term external, but the world that you have access to, at least, right? And we have access to it through many different ways, through microscopes, through all sorts of refined instruments, and somehow we manage to synthesize it in many ways. And we are often mistaken, and we correct it. That's good. And that's just how we, I guess, increase it. It's really like science is an approach to evidence, if you will, right? And it's all we have. It's the best approach we have, right? And it will evolve and be refined as we go onwards, right?
There's one concern that I have about the kind of emergence of kind of Bayesian approaches across so many disciplines, including the cognitive sciences. I mean, I won't claim to be the most well informed about this. I don't do research in this area, but my reading about it, the sense I get is that it's become something like an article of faith, and the way that it gets deployed is to kind of look for anything at some level of description that resembles kind of something that fits the Bayesian formulas, and then to say that is the explanation. It's because it's Bayesian that's happening. And to me, that's sort of to make the model, to find the data that fits the model, rather than to kind of look at mechanism and ask yourself, is that what's doing the explaining? And so there's a kind of weird Pythagoreanism to it, where it's like the math is so elegant, this must be what's doing it. And it just doesn't seem right in cognitive science. This is an issue with kind of like Bayesian theories of perception, is that sure, it will turn out that if you're doing you're updating your probabilities in the right sort of way to get an accurate view of the world, it will be Bayesian. But is that why it's happening? Well, it's not clear that that's sort of a very deep explanation of why perception, why bits of the body are doing that, or why your behavior is that way. And so I imagine that there would be a similar concern in physics, as well. And so the thing I'm seeing in sort of your description is something like, well, isn't that what physics has been doing all along? And it's like, well, in lots of ways, no. And maybe it should be doing that, and that would be a cool suggestion. But like, what are you trying to describe here? What we've actually been up to? Well, I don't know about that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely.
I think there's a hand from the audience who's looking at the person.
Oh, is there? Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. There's Paul.
Did he ask the question already, or?
So he asked a question in the Q&A a while ago. I'll
it's up to you. I mean,
I'll click the allow to talk button, and then so Paul, if you still have a question, hopefully you'll be able to ask it now.
It was this. Oh, hello. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
No.
Okay. Yeah. I have a follow-up question to my earlier question, and that's that Christoph seemed to think that quantum physics was special in being the only source of holism. I'm wondering that whether there are possibly other sources of holism, like the holism of an organism in relation to its constituent parts. We can talk about things, for example, like the function of the heart, which is hard to put in the language of physics, but it's extremely useful for understanding, and probably refers to real organizational properties of the system. Okay, so my question is aren't there other forms of holism that we might need to that we can avail ourselves of besides the holism of quantum coherent states that might be perhaps more useful in understanding the holism of biological systems?
So I wouldn't want to say that it's the only source of any kind of holism. I think what I'm saying is it offers a kind of holism that is unique, that like no classical system has, and I'm hoping that is somehow a hint, for that might help us understand consciousness. But sure, like I said, I think the holism of other things like the heart or other systems that are somehow organized and work as a system is still what I was saying is like that can still be understood. You can still cut it into its pieces, and you describe what each piece is doing, and that is actually a completely adequate description too of what's going on. Like you can take the perspective of looking at it in a holistic way, but you don't have to. Whereas for quantum systems, you have to. You have no choice. So that's a higher level of holism, I guess.
Well, but in the case of the heart, okay, you could give a purely physical description of the heart, okay, but in order to understand the heart's function, you have to understand its situation in respect to the rest of the organism. So that seems to be a kind of holism which is not can't be understood reductively. In other words, I can have a reductive description of all the physical facts about the heart, okay, but if I don't know of its situation with respect to the whole organism, I can't explain what its function is.
I mean, there are two ways to go there, though, right? The one way that I think many biologists go is to say so much the worse for thinking of those as functions, right? I mean, that's one way of understanding what the lesson of, for example, Darwinism is supposed to be. You might have thought that things were created for purposes, but it just turns out those are statistical generalizations over populations. Phenotypes you find in populations. So that's just to say, I mean, I'm actually, in support of thinking that there's something, in my own thinking, I do think that there's something special about that kind of explanation. But I think Christoph is right that, there's something unique about the kind of holism that he's talking about, in that it's not optional. You can't describe the behavior of what's happened, of sort of fundamental things without engaging in that kind of description. And so the further argument we need is that we need to think of hearts as having functions. Well, why would that be?
Well, can I add to I think I both agree. I think that it's not necessarily these things are incompatible, but there's something to be said about, so we have to describe, let's take the heart example. I think it's a good example. So the heart has all sorts of dispositions, and some of them are functions. One function is to be able to pump liquids, preferably blood. But I don't think you can I think it's fair to say, maybe even as universal rule here, that you can never infer an entity's role without having some sort of a holistic picture of where that entity fits in. So it's not that the heart has the function of the respiratory system. No, it plays a role in the respiratory system to pump around blood, or to pump around oxygen, basically in the body, right? And that we can only infer from actually studying the whole. I don't know if I'm kind of going off body. At least that would be the approach that you would take in applied ontology. So
another example is perhaps a bit more useful. Think of a neurotransmitter. There are many different chemical substances with different properties that function as neurotransmitters. The way we identify neurotransmitters as such is because of their functional role in causing diffusing across the synapse and causing activity in the postsynaptic cell, not because of its internal chemical properties, because of it. Well, certainly it has to have certain properties in order to perform that function, but there's lots of different substances that can still perform that same function. So they're different in chemistry, but the same in their relationship to the rest of the organism. That's what allows them to perform a function.
Roles goes with everything. Yeah, I think you're like, take stem cells, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What's the role of a stem cell? I think that's trivially true, but I don't think it's incompatible with what Christoph is saying as such. I think it's just,
yeah, my point is just that those are perspectives. You can take that perspective and you can understand it as a neurotransmitter, and you can have that whole story in your mind, but it's in your mind. Like you can still understand what the neurotransmitter molecule is doing and predict what it's going to do without thinking about that. And whereas if that neurotransmitter molecule is entangled with some other neurotransmitter molecule or something, then you can't do that anymore.
So I'm going to switch sides now in this in terms of what I'm saying here. But this is sort of what I was pressing you on before about the relationship between different levels of explanation. You've just said these higher levels are just in our minds. And so the thing is, I think Paul's point is something like neuroscience, the way that it is practiced, its entities, the practice of that science involves postulating those things. Its objects presumably are not just in the mind, right? And so to get those two types of explanations to play together, we can't say the thing where really, it's the physical stuff. We have to find some way to say it's also really in the world a neurotransmitter, or really also in the world a living thing, which is a discrete unit.
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that
Yeah. I'm just
can be useful or essential for understanding what's going on, but that's a different bar from saying.
I take that point as well.
It can be understood at the basic level too. So I don't need to postulate holism at the basic level to understand what's going on there. Whereas if there is an entangled thing involved, then I don't have that choice. I just have to accept that is a unified system and this is the system. I can't really cut it into pieces anymore. And that's still, I think, a fundamental.
Think of a computer. Let's take another system. Think of a computer. I can, in principle, give a purely physical description of the computer in terms of the properties of semiconductors and electrical conduction and all that. But that explanation would not tell me anything about why the computer is organized the way it is instead of some other way, or why a person might build it, or why a person might sit in front of it, or any of the things. It couldn't possibly provide that explanation. In fact, since there are many different physical systems that can serve as computers, at one time vacuum tubes and relays were the constituent parts of computers. In the future, optical components might be the constituents of computers. So we couldn't even pick out a computer as such without the higher level description. Okay, the purely physics description leaves certain essential questions about it unanswered.
Totally, yeah. There is no disagreement there. So I think the question is like whether the mind is like that. You know, is it holistic just in that sense, or is it holistic in a deeper sense too? And I'm saying there is a deeper sense of holism that exists, and I think that the mind is holistic in that deeper sense, not just in the sense of, you know, what you're describing for the heart or the computer. But it's
Yeah, I have a question.
it's an
Oh, sorry.
opinion,
Go ahead.
of course.
So let me ask you about, and this is something I'm not sure I understand about quantum entanglement, and that's that, as I understand it, you can't use it to communicate information from one place to another because since it's instantaneous, that would mean faster than light communication, which is forbidden by Einstein's theory. So that if it doesn't give you a way of communicating between areas of the brain, okay, then what good is it? What does it get you as far as explaining the integration of conscious experience if it doesn't explain how I can that an object is having both a color and shape and motion, okay, if it doesn't allow the exchange of information between brain areas.
So it doesn't allow instantaneous exchange of information.
Yeah.
So quantum information processing is still useful, you know, and we are working on it as a technology, right? And we know that quantum information processors can do certain things better than classical information processors can. But it's true that it's not instantaneous. But I don't think that's a big concern. The brain is not that big, you know, like even if things move at the speed of light, that's still very fast. But
then, okay, then so why not suppose that the integration that results in our experience of the holism of conscious experience is due to ordinary neural processing, and that the holism is something like the holism of the function of the heart, rather than some special quantum thing.
Personally, I don't find that satisfactory. But of course, it's an opinion, right?
But what's missing? Why should I want to introduce quantum processes?
Because I think that consciousness is sort of fundamentally holistic.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to map onto something that's fundamentally holistic. And the only thing I know in the physical world that's fundamentally holistic is entanglement.
So I guess it ends up being whether one thinks physics as being more fundamental than physiology or computational neuroscience or something like that, or whether it's just another perspective.
That, I mean, this is where I was coming at it from, right?
Maybe.
So that and I think that, you know, you're perhaps being a bit more conciliatory than your position actually is, which is that, you know, there's something important about the asymmetry between sort of the physical explanation and other explanations which are, you know, based on it. So the kind of so where I think Paul's coming from, and the thing I'm sympathetic to in what Paul is proposing, is that it is more just of a web in which, you know, it would be wrong to think of there being really hard priority.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's our job to provide the fundamental sort of story, but what that means is always moving at the same time, right? But there is sort of the goal of physics is to provide the fundamental description, and then the question is how does that?
Well, but oftentimes, I'm sorry, go ahead. Oftentimes, though, in order to even identify the physical object of inquiry, you need higher order concepts. For example, why would a physicist study semiconductors? It's only, you know, probably they are using higher order functional concepts to understand that if I can make a semiconductor that can change its state faster, I can make better computers. So it seems to me that even in order to identify the physical object of inquiry, you need higher order concepts. You need other levels.
Yeah.
That does seem susceptible to me, though, of like a psychological reduction, you know, because you're talking about interest, right? It's contingent what scientists are interested in. And, you know, that does seem to be in the mind, that we're interested in certain things and not others, right? So I think there's, again, you know, I'm kind of sympathetic to where you're going. I'm just pressing on the way you're trying to get there. So, you know, in support of Christoph, you could go away where you say, you know, like that.
I think I'm just saying for the examples that part that you are giving, I can always also tell like a sort of reductionist, non-holistic story that is going to reproduce exactly, you know, how the heart works or how this computer works and so on. Whereas for some things you can't do that. And
what about physical processes where you need the higher level description, like the Navier-Stokes equation treats fluids as a continuum and doesn't take into account the atomic and molecular constituents, but it still works. And in fact, it works for it's universal. It explains lots of different fluids that have different micro descriptions.
Yeah, but I mean, every physicist would say it's an effective description. So it's, you know, it's not the fundamental description. Of course it works, you know, of course these things work.
Well, if you want to explain those universalities, the fact that fluids with different micro descriptions nevertheless follow those, are behave in accord with those equations, that's a different sort of fundamentality. That the universalism of different of physical processes that have different micro descriptions have the same macro description. Isn't that sort of a different kind of fundamentality?
There are two ways to go on this, though. I mean, the philosophy on this, either you think that the cases explain the rule, and you seem to be suggesting that the rule explains the cases, but there's just, you know, there's really strong debate about which way that we should understand that.
Also, right. I mean, I'm not trying to say, I think that we will have many sort of probably levels of description of how the mind works and how that relates to the brain. And I don't think that we will necessarily have to invoke these quantum concepts at every level, right? So there may well be Navier-Stokes equations for the mind too, eventually. I just think that sort of at the fundamental level, maybe we will discover that it's quantum, if that makes sense. That doesn't mean that you have to worry about that all the time and that Rasmus will have to learn, you know, how Bell inequalities or something to treat his patients, sort of thing, right? That may or may not be necessary because of what you are saying, you know, that there's often different levels and like maybe the quantum will be sort of hidden from view. I just think it might be there, you know, because I think there's a puzzle otherwise. I don't think the brain is like the heart.
What's just speculating about this, right? So I think what I find appealing about locating it at the level of biology is that seems to be where we find this stuff. So my worry for sort of going the direction that you're talking about is that we might end up finding, you know, that sort of property. It seems more prevalent than the biological, but it seems like biological things are the only things that we kind of know to be conscious. So maybe that's a hint as to sort of where we ought to find it.
But at the same time, the biologists are the most reductionist people I know.
Well, this is what I'm saying to Paul, right? Is that when you ask them, actual biologists don't really think this stuff. It's usually philosophers of biology or other people.
Yeah, at least the ones I know, they don't think of it like that at all. They are extremely mechanistic.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the physicists are better friends of yours in that endeavor, because like we actually know that reductionists in our approach.
I should probably go, though. I need to eat lunch before a 3 o'clock meeting.
All right. Well, thanks for a great question, Paul. That was a really cool conversation. And thanks to all three of you guys for a really, really great dialogue. I think this was, discussion, whatever you want to call it. I guess there's more than two
Thanks
people.
so much for the invitation.
Yeah, that was really great.
This was very fun. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
I'm just glad that everyone was able to come together. This was, I think, quite excellent. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Talking to you guys.
Good to meet you, Christoph.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.